So, is the UK sliding into state capture? That's the question that I'm seeking to answer. So first I'm going to describe what I mean by state capture. I'm going to provide a framework for thinking about it and identifying it. Then I'm going to talk about how it manifests in certain countries around the world today. And finally, I'm going to consider whether the UK is indeed sliding into state capture. So state capture is a concept that I first came across when I was working as a journalist at the beginning of my career living in Eastern Europe. It's a kind of high-level and systematic corruption. So it's different to classic bribery or petty corruption, which is where someone essentially pays a bribe to influence a decision about the implementation of rules or policy. So say a property developer pays a bribe to get permission to build on a piece of brownfield land. It's a one-off benefit that distorts how existing rules are implemented. State capture then is something that occurs earlier in the process. It's about improperly influencing those in power again, but it's about influencing not the way that they implement the rules, but the way that the rules are formed in the first place. Going back to our previous example, it would be capture if the property developer gave a big donation to a political party, for example, in exchange for a government minister changing the rules about what kinds of property could be built on brownfield. So state capture has a much longer term impact than that petty or administrative corruption. After you've influenced the law or policy in that way, then you get access to a whole new landscape of opportunity. Rather than just influencing one decision, you've changed the whole rules of the game. So when the developer builds on brownfield in the future, they're not breaking any laws. They don't need to go and bribe anyone to do that. What they're doing has the law on their side. It's baked in, and their advantage is baked in to the system. So state capture then tends to exacerbate inequality. Groups that gain power in this way are better able to influence political leaders also in the future. And so it becomes what Darren Acemoglu has referred to as extractive institutions, institutions that exist largely to extract for narrow interest groups, rather than being inclusive and serving the public interest. So the defining feature of state capture relates to process. The political process in which laws and policy are formed is distorted because narrow interest groups have too much control over it. It departs from the pluralist democratic model in which many interest groups compete for influence fairly, and those which are best able to build broad coalitions gain the power to shape laws. In state capture, the competition among interest groups is not fair. Capture groups gain influence because they have personal connections to those holding political power. And those holding political power are prepared to abuse their power over the policy-making process by making secret deals in which they essentially provide influence in exchange for various kinds of loyalty from the capture group. This loyalty can take many forms. It might be the use of violence to quieten political opposition. It might be influence over key bodies of voters through trade unions or regional vote buying. It might be big donations to political parties or individuals. So the term state capture, as I mentioned at the beginning, is often something that we associate with the first decade of transition in the former Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. Then, the captors were typically business people with good political connections. We've come to call them the oligarchs, as their power and control over vast swathes of the economy has grown. But their method was pretty simple. They bought influence through personal connections to individuals and parties holding political power. And the people in office were prepared to sell their influence over policy formation. And critically again, by using state capture to change the laws, not just to change how they were implemented, they made sure that their actions were legal, that their power was consolidated. Indeed, this is something that we're debating a lot today as we seek to go after the corrupt gains of oligarchs, using Magnitsky sanctions, for example. And it's a problem that actually what was done within the legal framework because it was a result of capture rather than administrative corruption. It makes it much harder to take action later. Now, that kind of state capture seemed to be driven by business interests. That's how we assumed it worked at the time. The political sphere was seen more as vulnerable to exploitation, and of course complicit in it, but not so much an active agent. Now, in the last decade or two, we've seen a new type of state capture emerge in which politicians are driving the process. So in Hungary, already been mentioned this morning, in Turkey, Brazil, leaders have got into power through elections, but then radically changed the rules of the game in ways that entrench their power and have made it much more difficult to challenge them, let alone hold them to account. So this politics-led state capture is, if you like, in our common terms these days, a mutation. And it's a more serious variant. It still involves capturing the process by which laws are formed, but it's also spread into two other spheres. So the second sphere, not formation of the law, is actually now the implementation of policy. If captor groups want to control all of the opportunities for decision-making as much as possible, then rather than allowing the bureaucracy to be a neutral implementer of its captured laws, they tend also to appoint cronies to key positions in ministries and implementing agencies, and thereby using that extensive patronage power not only to appoint people to key roles, but also to have the threat of firing them. They are able to influence the decisions that officials make, as well as having influenced the laws. Those decisions are about how grants are allocated, who gets contracts for government business, and also budgetary decisions around how much money is flowing to particular ministries or agencies, and can then potentially be spent for corrupt gain. The third sphere of capture is around disabling the accountability institutions. So this is where captor groups try to close down or disable potential checks on their power, as we've been hearing a lot this morning from the distinguished panel. So the key constitutional checks on executive power are, of course, Parliament and the judiciary. Parliament can often be neutralised fairly easily if the executive has a large majority. But this process is then smoothed by using procedures that diminish the time for parliamentary scrutiny of proposed legislation, or allowing for skeleton laws to be passed that delegate much of the detail of regulation to civil servants. The independence of the judiciary can be compromised in many ways, as we've heard. In state capture, it's often by politicising the appointment process, or methods even for allocating particular cases to particular judges. But other institutions that are supposed to check administrative power can also be undermined. You can appoint a crony to head the Supreme Audit Institution, for instance, or just cut its budget. The media can be defanged in many ways, including by denying broadcast licenses to outlets that are seen as critical of the government, or withdrawing government advertising and hence cutting off a significant revenue stream. Likewise, civil society groups can be squashed through repressive laws and smear campaigns. These extra dimensions of capture become possible and likely when political elites are driving the process rather than business interests. They become possible because political elites typically hold various forms of political power over the bureaucracy, as well as in relation to institutions such as the judiciary, Supreme Audit Institution, and the media. They can usually determine appointments, cut their budgets, and withhold operating licenses. Such patterns become likely because the captor groups see accountability institutions as a threat to their power. An independent and expert bureaucracy can be a challenge by preventing government from using state resources for political ends and holding them to due process. The accountability institutions, through upholding the rule of law, revealing misconduct and maladministration, and informing the public about it, can expose wrongdoing and elicit popular demand for change. Hence, there's a clear logic to captor elites exerting power over these second and third spheres, capturing not just policy making, but also its implementation, and also disabling the accountability institutions that are supposed to hold the executive to account. In the short term, this facilitates the unchecked stealing of state funds and assets in many examples of state capture that we see around the world. And longer term, it helps to ensure that the captor elites stay in power by undermining any potential challengers. So Hungary then. Hungary is a country that I lived in for many years in the first decade of the millennium. And Hungary under Viktor Orban, who was elected in 2010, has become a prime example of this modern politics-led state capture. Orban was elected in 2010 with a 2/3 majority in parliament, which gave him the right to change the constitution. He did so in a number of ways that strengthened his own power and weakened checks and balances that were supposed to hold the executive to account. Just as a few examples, he started with the judiciary. He appointed a crony as chief prosecutor, changed the way that judges were appointed so that many of the existing judges were also fired, and restricted the jurisdiction of the Constitutional Court. Then he silenced the media. He restructured the media regulator, appointed another crony to head it, and then channeled all of the state advertising contracts to friendly outlets. There's virtually no free media in Hungary today. He even changed the rules for getting elected. Orban redrew electoral boundaries, granted votes to huge diaspora communities outside Hungary's borders who tend to support him. In the last couple of years, he's used COVID emergency powers to cut public funding for opposition-led municipalities for the recent election. In some ways, this is relatively subtle. In other countries, leaders just rewrite the constitution to extend term limits or surf between the presidency and premiership to hold on to power. But it's very extensive constitutional change. So Orban has been an innovator in state capture, I would argue. He's been extremely systematic about it. In just over a decade, Hungary's gone from being seen as an absolute frontrunner of democratization in Central Europe to describing itself as a pioneer of illiberal democracy. So, just to recap then on the three spheres of this new type of politically driven state capture. In Sphere 1, the formation of law and policy, the key targets are the Constitution, elections, the legislature, bodies that set the rules of the game. But I would also add here sources of physical and economic power. It's highly beneficial for captor elites to be able to control the state's instruments of physical violence, the military and police, in order to suppress opposition. And control over strategic economic assets, particularly natural resources and utilities, through state-owned enterprises, for example, allows more money to be easily channeled out of the state through privatization and public procurement. But it's in Sphere 2, implementation, that captors are best able to ensure that state funds get allocated to their preferred recipients. The key targets of capture here are public appointments, budgets, government contracts, and regulatory decisions. Make sure you control the ministries which spend most money. Then you can control the way they spend it. So this is where we explicitly see much of the corruption and embezzlement. And then control over sphere 3, the accountability ecosystem, is critical to disable any checks on power that might get in your way. That means undermining the autonomy of the judiciary by controlling appointments or disciplinary systems or the way that cases are allocated, curbing the powers or independence of the Supreme Audit Institution, and it means undermining the free media, which represents a major threat because of its ability to uncover corruption and inform the public, potentially triggering electoral accountability. Controlling the media is thus a priority for most capture groups. They invest heavily in creating new media as well to propagate positive stories about the governing elite. It also means undermining civil society groups that play a watchdog role on government, often having the technical expertise to compile and communicate evidence about corrupt practices. In state capture, governments clamp down on these groups by changing the laws that allow them to access funding, by banning foreign donations, for example. They make the rules for their registration restrictive and burdensome, and seek to smear their reputations or undermine their reports. And some capture networks also seek to purge academics that criticise the government by defunding universities that don't support the government line, explicitly firing academics, or undermining academic independence through culture war rhetoric. So in examples of state capture around the world today, we see many of these patterns playing out. In Europe, we've seen this not just in Hungary, but also in Serbia, and some elements of it in Poland and in Slovenia. It's very much characteristic of Turkey under Erdogan, and further afield, Putin's Russia, Modi's India, Bolsonaro's Brazil are also examples of democratically elected leaders that then moved in this direction. Sri Lanka is a fascinating case where the state has been captured by one family, which controls around 25% of the budget, although recent protests have started to unravel that. Now, in captured states, business and political elites exist in a relationship of codependency. The boundaries between government and business are very blurred, and sometimes are deliberately blurred more. So what about Britain? Is Britain sliding into state capture? So previously I've written about the Johnson government's attacks on the accountability institutions. So I'll start there with the third sphere. I think this is where the instances are most numerous. We've actually heard plenty about the attacks on the judiciary this morning, but we've seen, just to recap, the government openly questioning the impartiality of judges, calling for political oversight of judicial appointments, planning a new mechanism to allow it to correct court judgments that ministers believe are incorrect. And this hatred of the judiciary seems to stem in part from the fact that it has curbed some of the government's attempts to expand executive power in the past, most prominently the Supreme Court ruling unlawful the decision to prorogue Parliament in 2019, itself seemingly motivated by an effort to undermine Parliament's role in scrutinising Brexit policy. Then there's the media. The government has launched an ongoing attack on the BBC, a highly trusted public service broadcaster. It's questioned its neutrality and weakened its funding base. The government's decision to privatise Channel 4 also threatens to remove a key independent check on the executive. And its efforts to install a crony as media regulator, albeit a failed attempt, were also worrying. The Johnson government has also undermined a number of regulatory bodies that are important in this accountability sphere. In the Elections Bill, it sought to remove the Electoral Commission's power to prosecute those who break election rules, opening the door to abuse of campaign finance rules. It's shown disregard for the decisions of bodies who regulate conduct in public office. The Prime Minister entirely ignored the independent advisor on ministerial interests when he found that Priti Patel had breached the ministerial code. He disregarded the House of Lords Appointments Commission when it recommended against conferring a peerage on Tory donor Peter Cruddas. He failed to take action concerning a number of other allegations of misconduct relating to his cabinet, perhaps the Robert Jenrick case most prominently, despite the fact that he's the only one who can initiate an investigation. And then in November, when Owen Paterson, one of the government's own MPs, was to be disciplined by Parliament for egregiously breaking the rule that MPs must not engage in paid advocacy, the government blocked the process and sought to overturn the whole system for regulating parliamentary misconduct. Boris Johnson has, of course, breached the Code of Conduct himself many times, in 9 different ways in 2018 alone, and been accused of breaching the Ministerial Code many times too. He repeatedly fails to declare hospitality, gifts, interests, whether relating to flat refurbishments, holidays in the Caribbean, or jobs on the side. And of course, then there's Partygate, his police fine, and this week's 3-line whip on the parliamentary vote. This is not yet Orban territory. Most of these attacks have been in that third sphere. They are efforts to weaken and undermine institutions that would hold the government to account. But then again, Britain's a much more mature democracy than Hungary. You might need to start by disabling the accountability institutions if you intend to capture the other 2 spheres. Otherwise, they'll get in your way. So indeed, there might be a difference in the sequencing of these 3 spheres in different countries, depending on how strong the institutional checks are and how quickly they can be subverted. But let's look at how Britain under Johnson fares in the other 2 spheres. Let's look at the ways that he's sought to increase his control over the implementation of policy. There have been a number of efforts to install political allies in key public appointments. Indeed, the Public Appointments Commissioner has raised concerns about practices here. There was, of course, the abuse of the COVID emergency to set up a VIP lane for COVID contracts, allowing ministers to recommend their friends, and with evidence from the National Audit Office finding that those in this channel were 10 times more likely to win contracts. And we've seen many examples of lobbying by insiders to influence decisions. The Greensill affair was quite extraordinary for the blatant way in which a former Prime Minister sought to use his insider status to lobby for a company that was paying him a hefty fee. And it also revealed that a very senior civil servant, quite incredibly, had been paid by Greensill for 3 months while still working in the Cabinet Office. Then there's the first sphere, influence over the formation of laws and policy. The British executive is, of course, able to wield great influence over the legislature in any case, as long as it has a large parliamentary majority. The payroll vote and the party whip help to ensure that Parliament is a fairly muted check on executive power in the best of times. And there are many ways in which parliamentary power has declined in recent years. I think we'll hear more about that in the next panel. Here again, the government has explicitly sought to reduce Parliament's opportunities for scrutiny, in particular by excessive use of secondary legislation, for example, and of course that attack on the parliamentary standards system in the Owen Paterson case. So overall, what is my take? Is the UK sliding into state capture? I think I have set out some evidence here that this is indeed happening. It's particularly evident in a series of attacks by this government on the institutions that are supposed to hold them to account. But then again, there has also been a robust response to a number of these attempted encroachments. British accountability institutions are fighting back, and they've managed to fend off attacks in a number of cases. The accountability ecosystem is certainly not yet captured, and it is asserting its independence in a number of ways. Moreover, if we wanted to talk about Britain as a captured state, we would need a clearer idea of who the captor group is, a point that was raised in the questions just now, and to what end they engage in capture. Now, potentially we might argue that there's a small faction of politicians in the Conservative Party with an ideological motivation, who might well be the captor group. But I would also agree with Alison's comments that it's difficult to see many of the encroachments on power that I've outlined as part of a carefully planned and orchestrated strategy. More often, they seem like impulsive and reactionary moves to fend off criticism by a government that is, frankly, stumbling and U-turning its way through life. The Johnson government will certainly leave a worrying legacy in the way that it has shamelessly broken norms and violated conventions, making it easier for those who come next to do the same and go further. Britain might therefore have become more vulnerable to future capture if a more organised captor group were to gain power. Once you've made these kinds of changes to checks and balances, it's very easy for a narrow interest group to become dominant and to abuse its power to serve itself to the exclusion of others. And once such a group has converted political power into economic power, it's very difficult to turn back that process. Another way of looking at it, though, is to consider how the recent developments have already been underpinned and facilitated by changes in the way that government functions that have occurred over the previous decades. There is an increasingly close and intertwined relationship between business and politics, and there are a few large businesses that seem to have considerable influence. Large donations explicitly buy access to the ear of ministers in today's Britain, as well as potentially to honours and peerages. And party finance reform, while long overdue, is going nowhere. The revolving door between public and private roles is very well oiled and still barely regulated, despite repeated calls for tougher rules. We've also seen that many MPs have very lucrative and time-consuming second jobs, and cases like the Patterson affair reveal the risks that this brings in terms of improper influence. And the extensive use of consultants in government gives a few large businesses considerable opportunities to influence the implementation and design of large swathes of public policy and public spending in a world where so much public service provision is outsourced. Thinking back then to post-Soviet Russia in those early transition years, an academic called Janine Vadel described how in those Wild West times there were many institutional nomads. These were individuals who strategically moved between public sector and private sector roles, depending on where they could best access advantages. By surfing on the rules applying to different sectors, they effectively operated in a world where they were so well able either to influence the rules or to make themselves immune to them by shifting their shape, that they effectively existed above and outside legal and regulatory frameworks. Seen from that perspective, Britain is a state that is becoming more vulnerable to capture. It's far from a post-Soviet style oligarchy, and it's nowhere near the illiberal democracy of Hungary under Orban. But the institutional protections against capture are becoming weaker, and the underlying conditions of blurred lines between business and politics are definitely there. We have a tendency to see corruption and bribery as something that only happens in poor countries, or at least elsewhere. But this is a kind of Orientalism. Corruption happens everywhere, and there's really nothing special about Britain. There was a time, too, when Hungary was regarded as a frontrunner of democratization in Eastern Europe. It was well known for the way that it had calmly negotiated the end of communism and regime change. It had had several peaceful changes of power. It had opened up its economy to investment in a way that seemed destined to entrench integration into a liberal market model. And that meant that when Orban started to make these changes, it was very difficult to convince anyone that this was the beginning of something far more worrying. So in Britain, let's not assume that we're somehow immune to this kind of slide. Let's shore up the checks and balances on executive power, and let's do a better job of policing conflicts of interest between business and politics. I used to see democratisation as an inexorable process, a journey from A to B. But I think now it's more like a journey where you're trying to get a carriage to the top of a hill. Once you've got to the hill, there's always the chance that the carriage starts slipping down again. And once it has started sliding down, it is quite literally an uphill struggle to put it back at the top. It's really critical that we stop it from gaining momentum. Thank you.